Welcome everybody. In this video, we are going to keep on working on the survey page that we made in the last one. And if you remember in the last video, we created a second HTML. We linked up our index with our second HTML and vice versa so that we've got a link where we can click back and forth between them. And on our second HTML, we built a little input form we're going to use for collecting user input. And we built this because we want to get user input in a way that doesn't require you to drop down that little thing every time. But the page doesn't look very good. So I'm going to save all just to make sure I've captured any changes. And I am going to go ahead and load it in Google Chrome to remind everybody of what it looks like. So I'm going to go to Open File. I'm going to open my index.html and it's going to prompt me for my favorite animal because the JavaScript is still running on that page. I haven't taken it off yet. And this is the web page from one of our previous videos. We're going to click through to the survey, which is what we made on our last one. And you'll notice there's basically no styling applied. And so in order to get styling applied, we're going to have to do a couple of different things. The first is we need to hook up our default.css, our style sheet, to this page. If we go back to index.html, we can see that the link to our style sheet is actually in our head. So I'm just going to copy this out and paste it into survey.html. Now I'm going to save this, but it's not going to do anything yet. And the reason it's not going to do anything is because in our default.css, we're only styling one type of element. We're only styling P or paragraph elements. So I don't have any of those in my survey. Now I could wrap my entire form in a paragraph element. And I could save that. Give me just 1 second. I'm going to add that closing paragraph tag. I could save that and I could reload it and still nothing is going to change. We're going to get a little bit of space here because now it's inside of a paragraph, but none of the text is styled, and that's because none of the text is actually inside of that paragraph element. It's inside of our label elements. So we could style the labels if we wanted to. And remember, the way you do it in CSS is you call out the type of element you want to style, and then you set the style attributes inside of those curly braces. So let's say we want these to be, let's say we want them something different. Let's do them dark green. And now when I save this and I reload it, it's going to style those input elements as dark green. Now we don't want to do that. I'm actually going to style them as black. And that is going to cause them to go back to the same color. I'm going to take out that paragraph element. I don't necessarily want that to be in a paragraph. So we can go ahead and reload the page, and it's going to look basically the same. But now we've got the structure in place to start styling these elements. So there's a couple of things I want to practice in this video. One of them is using Google to look up how to do stuff. So we know we want to style form input elements here, but maybe we don't know what options we have for that. So we're going to just go to Google, and we are going to look for form input styling CSS. And you can see I've Googled this before. It's going to autofill it for me. And it's going to bring up a number of results. And I want to sort of talk through how to think about these results. The first one is from a site called W3 Schools. It's a very good resource. I think it's one I've mentioned in class before. But it's got a lot of good reference material. It has testers where you can try out different changes, stuff like that. We've got a couple of blogs here, which might be okay. We've got a link to the Mozilla developer resources, which is going to be very thorough, very high quality information, but it might be a little complex for what we need here. We've got something called free front end, which looks like garbage to me. Anything that has free in the title, anything that tells you how many CSS forms or how many assets it's going to give you. It's generally going to be lower quality. We got some more blogs down here. One of these is from 2014. I probably wouldn't go there. So we'll start with, it just happens to be the case that our first result is also the one I want to look at. So we'll click into that. And you pretty much immediately you can see that this looks like what we're looking for. It says the look of an HTML form can be greatly improved with CSS. Well, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to improve the look of our HTML form. So this page, there's a couple of different ways we can interact with this. We can go down and see all of the different properties we can set to change the way they look. So we can set the width property. We can set padding, which is space inside of the element. We can set margin, which is space outside of the element. We can set a border. We can do all this stuff. We can also go into one of their testers here on this. So you'll see these try it yourself buttons. This is pretty cool. I can go into this tester, and then I can see all of the HTML they've got that's showing the page here on the right, and I can change it live. So I could change the width of this to 80%. I could hit run, and you'll see how it changes how they're styled. We're going to change that back to 100%. And what I'm going to do with this is I'm not going to copy this code, but I am going to use it to understand what my options are and how I want to set these things up. So a couple of things I want to point out is their CSS is actually just in their HTML. It's in a style tag. You can do that too. It's best practice to use a CSS, an individual CSS file to manage your styling. But because we've only got one file here, they've put it all in the HTML. The other thing I want to point out is their form is actually inside of what's called a div element. A div element is basically a container element that is used for applying CSS and manipulating things with JavaScript. So let's go ahead and pop ours in a div. And you're going to see this doesn't actually change anything until we style or otherwise manipulate the div. So I'm going to go ahead and put this end tag down here. And you'll notice that I've got this indentation here because it shows me what's inside of everything else. Every level in is inside of the level above it. So our form is inside of the div, our labels and inputs are inside of our form, and our div and form and labels and inputs are inside of our body, and everything is inside of our HTML document. So when I save this, I'm actually going to go back to Chrome. I'm going to show you what this looks like without the div. I'm going to save all in code, and I'm going to reload in Chrome. Didn't change anything. But I can start to style my div, which is the container element for my form. And you'll notice that's what they do here. That's how they get this sort of gray color, and that's how they get this little bit of padding, is by styling their div. And they've got border radius, which means the corners are going to be rounded. They've got a background color. Well, we might not want to do all of this, but I do like having the border there, and I do like the little bit of padding. So let's try that. Let's try putting that in our div and see what that looks like on our website. So I'm going to style a div as well, and I am going to put a border that is 3 pixels. It's going to be a solid border, and it's going to be dark green. And I know these things have to go in this element, in this order, but if you look at how they style their input borders, you can actually see that they're showing us how to do this. It's width, style, which is just solid, and then color. They're using a hex color. We're just going to use a named color here. So I'm going to save all, and I'm going to reload. And now we're going to see that there's some styling applied to my div. Now it doesn't look fantastic, but it's starting to look a little bit more interesting at least. So some other stuff we can do, and this is stuff they do too, is they give everything a margin, which is going to push it in from the sides. It's going to make it look a little bit better. We'll give our div a margin of 12 pixels. You can use % for margins too. We're just going to work with pixels because we're using relatively small increments. And you'll notice that's going to bump our div in from the side. I would also like to bump my my input elements in from the side as well. So I'm going to give them a margin. And I'm styling my inputs, so I'm going to add that. I'm going to give a margin of, let's say, 8 pixels. That's a little bit smaller. We're going to save all here. And you'll notice that that spaces them out. So this is starting to look a little bit better. Now my labels are mashed up against that div, so I'm going to give my labels a margin as well. It's a good idea to give everything a margin or to style your stuff so that it's not all mashed up against each other. So we're going to save all. And one of the other things I want to reinforce here is I'm doing a bunch of testing. I don't necessarily know what sort of effect this is exactly going to have before I run it. So I'm trying it out. I'm putting in some values. I'm seeing how it affects the page. I'm saving and reloading often. That's a really good thing to do. So one of the other things I like about how they have this styled is all of their text boxes are the same width. And the way they're doing this is by specifying that these input elements, and you'll notice they've got 2 different types of input elements here. They've got a submit, which is a little drop down, and they've got the text input element. We're only styling one, we're only styling text. So we're just going to stick with styling input sort of broadly because we don't have any other types. But we're going to give it a width of 100%. And this is going to look a little bit different than theirs. And you'll notice it's overflowing our div a little bit. This is a quirk of how some browsers calculate the width of the input elements with respect to the div. So I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of why this is happening, but we can solve it pretty easily by just setting it to 95% instead of 100%. Sometimes, one of the challenges when you're working with CSS is that the browser is the tool that is interpreting everything you're writing. And JavaScript is pretty well defined, but CSS has a little bit more left to interpretation. So sometimes you'll get behaviors that seem to be counterintuitive. Sometimes you'll get behaviors that aren't what you expect. And you can spend a lot of time trying to figure those out, or you can work with what you know about styling to get something that looks reasonably good with the tools you've got at your disposal. So I think this looks a lot better than it did at the beginning. I think that this looks more like a thing that you would see on a real web page. It's not quite there, but we've made some improvements. One of the last things I want to do is I don't really like these sharp corners on any of my borders. So I'm going to add what's called a border radius, which is just and it goes in pixels. It's basically just a curve on the corners. So I'm going to save this. It's going to style my div only. And you'll notice it curves out a little bit, but I want it to be more curvy. So we're going to change it to 6 pixels. We're going to see what that looks like. I'm going to reload. That looks a little better. We're also going to curve out these input elements a little bit. Doing 6 pixels would be, well, let's try it actually. And remember, the input is the place where they put the text, and the label is the text that's next to the little form. That looks a little bit better. So now we've got a sort of broken out survey here that's inside of a div. We've applied some styling to the div. It may not look exactly the way we want it to, but it's starting to look a little bit better. So the last thing I'm going to do is add a little label here because I don't like to have this unlabeled survey. And we actually started out with one of those. I'm going to put it back into my HTML. It's going to go inside. Actually, it's going to go outside of my div. So it's going to act like a label for the div. And I'm just going to save this. And I'm going to reload it. And so now we've got a survey. We can't do anything with the input yet. We're going to get to that in a little bit. But we now have a little bit better ability to style our page. So as your skills check for this video, I want you to style your survey. You can put it in a div if you want. Divs are very useful for applying style. They're sort of generic containers that we can manipulate with CSS and JavaScript. But you don't have to. What I want you to do is use Google and use some iterative testing to get your survey with your questions styled the way you want it to look. So when you've done that, I'm not going to put any restrictions on that, with the exception that you have to do at least a little bit of styling. You can't leave the styling blank. So when you've got to the point where you think your survey is the way you want it to look, or you think it's as close as you're going to get it, let me know. And if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, or if you've got anything that you don't understand, as always, please raise your hand and we will take a look at it together. So once you get your skills check done for this video, you are ready to move on to the next one. Good luck, and thank you for your attention.